Why would HR tell me it's just business at 4:59 p.m. on a Friday, then spend the next month trying to stop me from collecting the $286,000 their own policy said I was owed? Because they assumed I had never read page 47. They eliminated my role 2 weeks before my annual bonus was scheduled to pay out. They expected me to sign a severance agreement, thank them for the opportunity, and walk away quietly. Instead, I treated their decision exactly the way they told me to treat it, as business. Every story here is about someone who got underestimated and made them regret it. My name is Claire Morgan, and for 11 years, I worked for a software company called Ardent Peak Systems. We sold logistics software. Not the kind of software people talk about at dinner parties. Not apps with bright icons and catchy slogans. We built the systems companies use to track warehouse inventory, shipping routes, delivery delays, purchase orders, and product shortages. If a national retailer needed to know why 8,000 boxes of medical supplies were stuck in Ohio instead of arriving in Texas, our software could tell them. If a manufacturer needed to predict which part would cause a production shutdown 3 weeks before it happened, our software could flag it. The work was complicated. The clients were demanding. And the contracts were large. A single enterprise account could be worth $2 million, $5 million, sometimes more. But software does not renew itself. People do. People who understand the client. People who remember what went wrong last year. People who can explain why a feature request cannot be delivered by Friday, but can still make a customer feel heard instead of ignored. That was my job. I was director of enterprise client success. I managed a team of 16 account managers and technical specialists. Together, we handled 12 major clients with annual recurring revenue of just over $38 million. My department was not sales. We did not win clients with flashy demonstrations and promises. We kept them after the promises became complicated. We were the team that got the phone call when an integration failed at 2 a.m. We were the team that joined emergency calls when a client's executives were angry. We were the team that translated technical language into business decisions. And when sales promised something unrealistic, we were the team that had to find a way to make it work without destroying the relationship. That was where I was useful. I knew the clients well. I knew which executive wanted a short answer and which one needed every detail. I knew who got nervous when a dashboard turned yellow. I knew which account had a procurement department that would challenge every invoice. I knew which client would forgive a technical problem if you told them the truth quickly, and which one would leave if they sensed you were managing the message instead of managing the issue. For years, I was good at my job because I did not confuse service with smiling. Service was preparation. Service was documentation. Service was telling people what they needed to know before they had to ask. And that made me valuable. It also made me inconvenient to people who preferred clean stories over difficult facts. The person who found me most inconvenient was our Vice President of Human Resources, Denise Calder. Denise had joined Ardent Peak 18 months before I was fired. She had come from a massive consulting firm and spoke like every conversation was a presentation to a board. She never said someone was fired. They were transitioned out of the business. She never said a department was cut. It was restructured for future readiness. She never said a policy was unfair. She said it was consistently administered. That phrase was her favorite. Consistently administered. Denise used it whenever someone asked a question she did not want to answer. Why did one manager receive a retention package while another did not? Policies are consistently administered. Why was the performance review process changed after bonuses had already been calculated? Policies are consistently administered. Why did executives receive special compensation terms that ordinary employees did not even know existed? Policies are consistently administered. She believed language could solve anything. If she used calm enough words, she thought people would forget the facts. The first time I challenged her was during a company-wide reorganization. Ardent Peak had missed its revenue target by 6%. Not a disaster. Not even close. But our CEO, Nathan Cole, had promised the board aggressive growth, and he needed to show he was doing something. So he hired consultants. The consultants created slides. The slides created new reporting lines. The new reporting lines created confusion. And somehow, the people doing the most direct client work were the ones asked to prove their value. My team lost 3 positions. I absorbed the work. I reorganized coverage plans. I reduced response times. I kept every major client through the transition. By the end of the year, our renewal rate was 96.4%. That was the highest of any client-facing division in the company. Then, in early November, I received an email from my manager asking me to meet with him and Denise at 4:30 p.m. that Friday. No agenda. No explanation. Just a calendar invite titled, Organizational Discussion. I had seen enough corporate calendar invites to know what that meant. At 4:30 p.m., I walked into a conference room with glass walls and no windows. Denise was already there with a folder. My manager, Aaron, was seated beside her. Aaron had been promoted 6 months earlier. He was smart, ambitious, and completely unprepared to manage people who knew more about the business than he did. He was also the kind of manager who nodded when executives spoke, even if they contradicted something he had said 10 minutes earlier. Denise waited until I sat down. Then she folded her hands on top of the folder and said, "Claire, this is a difficult conversation." I said, "I'm listening." She told me my position was being eliminated as part of a strategic restructuring. I would remain employed for 2 weeks to support a transition. After that, I would receive 12 weeks of severance, conditioned on signing a release agreement. I asked who would lead enterprise client success. Aaron said the function would be distributed across sales, support, and a new customer operations group. I looked at him. Who is leading the client renewal strategy? He said the commercial organization would own it. Who is responsible for the technical escalation plans? He said support would own it. Who is accountable when those 2 groups disagree? He glanced at Denise. That told me everything. No one had an answer. Then I asked the question that mattered. My bonus is scheduled to pay on December 15th. Does this restructuring affect it? Denise looked down at the folder. Then she looked back at me with the same calm expression. Under the annual incentive plan, you must be actively employed on the payment date to receive the discretionary award. I said, the performance period ends November 30th. That is correct. And I met every performance metric. You performed strongly. And the company has already calculated the payout. That information is confidential. I leaned forward. Denise, are you eliminating my role 2 weeks before the payout date so the company does not have to pay my bonus? Her expression did not change. Then she said the sentence that made everything after that possible. Claire, it's just business. She said it gently. Like she was offering wisdom. Like my 11 years, my team, my clients, and the bonus I had earned were all just figures in a spreadsheet. I looked at her folder. Then I looked at Aaron. Then I said, understood. Denise seemed relieved. She thought I had accepted it. What she did not know was that I had spent the past 6 years helping clients negotiate contracts with companies exactly like ours. I knew how corporate language worked. I knew where important conditions were hidden. And I knew that whenever someone tells you not to take something personally, it is usually because they are hoping you will not examine it professionally. Denise believed the company's policy was simple. No active employment on December 15th, no bonus. But 2 years earlier, after an executive threatened to leave, Ardent Peak had quietly added a protection to the incentive plan. It was buried in a section nobody ever talked about. And once I understood why it had been added, I realized they had not just made a cold decision. They had made a very expensive mistake. I did not argue in that meeting. That was the first thing Denise got wrong about me. She assumed calm meant defeated. She assumed silence meant agreement. She assumed I would go home, feel embarrassed, and sign whatever they sent me because I wanted the severance money. Instead, I went back to my office. I closed the door. I opened my personal notebook. And I wrote down everything. The time of the meeting. Who attended. The exact words Denise used. The date my employment would end. The date my bonus was scheduled to pay. The questions I asked. The answers they gave. Then I opened the company's internal policy portal. I did not download client files. I did not email confidential information to myself. I did not take anything I was not allowed to take. But I accessed the employee documents I had always been allowed to access. My offer letter. My employment agreement. The annual incentive plan. The performance scorecard. The policy addendums that everyone clicked through once a year without reading. And at 5:26 p.m., I found what I was looking for. Not the answer. Not yet. But the first crack in Denise's certainty. The incentive plan had the standard language she quoted. Employees needed to be actively employed on the payment date. But then there was another section. Section 7.4. It was titled, Treatment Upon Involuntary Separation. Most people would have skipped it. The writing was dense. The paragraphs were long. The words were designed to slow you down. But I had spent years reading contracts written by people who hoped nobody would read them closely. So I kept going. Section 7.4 said that if an employee was involuntarily terminated without cause after the conclusion of the performance period, and if the company had already determined the employee's performance results, the employee could be eligible for a prorated or full incentive payout. Could be eligible. That was not enough. Could be was the kind of phrase companies used to preserve discretion. Then I found the final paragraph. It said an employee would receive the Earned Incentive Award if the termination resulted from a non-performance-based organizational restructuring, provided that the employee had not received a rating below expectations and had remained available for reasonable transition support. I read it 3 times. Then I checked my review. Exceeds expectations. Then I checked the restructuring letter. Position eliminated due to strategic restructuring. Then I checked the transition instructions. Remain employed for 2 weeks to support transition. I met every condition. But there was a problem. The policy also said the employee had to sign the separation agreement. And Denise had not sent it yet. At 5:41 p.m., I received an email from her assistant. The subject line read, Confidential Separation Materials. Attached were 3 documents. A separation agreement, a release of claims, and a spreadsheet labeled Severance Calculation. The severance calculation was correct. 12 weeks of pay, unused vacation, continuation of benefits through the end of the month. The bonus was listed as 0. Not delayed. Not pending. 0. That was the first visible mistake. They had put their decision in writing before they had checked whether the plan supported it. I printed the documents. Then I went home. That night, I did not tell everyone I knew. I did not call former coworkers and stir up panic. I told my husband what happened. Then I called an employment attorney the next morning. Her name was Rachel Kim. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question. Do you have the current version of the incentive plan and the prior version? I did. Every year, I had saved copies of my compensation documents in my personal records. Not because I expected this moment. Because I had learned a long time ago that policies can change, portals can update, and people can suddenly forget what something said last year. Rachel reviewed both documents. Then she asked me to send my performance scorecard, my restructuring notice, and the bonus target calculation from the previous quarter. By Monday afternoon, she called me back. Her voice was measured, but I could hear something else underneath it. Interest. She said, Claire, I think Denise may have quoted only part of the policy. I said, that was my impression. Rachel explained that the language in Section 7.4 had been added after a senior executive dispute 2 years earlier. The company had eliminated a vice president's role after he had completed his performance targets, but before a significant incentive payment. He had challenged the company. The dispute had apparently become expensive enough that Arden Peak amended the plan to make the outcome clearer. They wanted to protect executives from being cut out of compensation they had already earned. But they did not limit the language to executives. The policy applied to all participants in the annual incentive plan, including me. Rachel said the bonus itself was not guaranteed until formally approved. But the company had a problem. My bonus target was 40% of my salary. My performance metrics had been finalized. My rating was complete. The company had already confirmed the bonus pool in a leadership meeting. And most importantly, their own restructuring letter said my termination was non-performance-based. They had checked every box that triggered the payout. I asked Rachel what we should do. She said, we do not threaten. We asked them to correct their calculation. That was exactly what I wanted. On Tuesday morning, she sent a letter to Denise and Arden Peak's general counsel. It was concise. It cited Section 7.4. It listed the relevant dates. It attached my performance rating. It noted that I remained available to complete the requested transition. And it asked the company to confirm that the incentive payout would be included in the separation agreement. No accusation. No drama. No emotional language. Just facts. At 10:14 a.m., Denise replied. Not to Rachel. To me. She wrote that she had received my counsel's correspondence and that Arden Peak stood by the separation agreement. Then she added, the incentive plan is administered consistently across all employees. There it was again. Consistently administered. I read the email twice. Then I forwarded it to Rachel. Rachel called me 15 minutes later. She is trying to make this sound routine, she said. Is it? No, Rachel said. If it were routine, legal would have answered. That was the second mistake. Denise wanted to show control. But by responding personally, before legal had reviewed the language, she created a record that made it look like the decision had been made by HR policy interpretation rather than a neutral compensation process. And that mattered. Because there was something else in the policy. A clause about selective treatment. If one group of employees received a benefit under the plan while another was denied the same benefit under materially identical circumstances, the company had to explain the distinction in writing. Rachel told me not to ask for a list of everyone's compensation. We did not need it. We only needed to know whether the policy had ever been applied differently. And I already knew one person it had. A year earlier, a senior sales director named Martin Shaw had been transitioned out in late December. Everyone knew he had received his bonus. Not because he told people. Because he bought a new boat and talked about it in the parking garage for 3 weeks. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now, I remembered the date. Martin's role had been eliminated after the performance period ended. Just like mine. His bonus had been paid after his final day. Just like mine should have been. I did not mention Martin's name in a company email. I gave it to Rachel. She requested confirmation of the company's practice under Section 7.4. That was when the tone changed. At 6:07 p.m., the general counsel contacted Rachel. They asked whether I would be willing to join a call the next morning. Not Denise. Not Aaron. Legal. The company had finally stopped calling it routine. If you have ever watched someone hide behind policy until you read the policy better than they did, subscribe. Because this was where "it's just business" became the most expensive phrase Denise ever said. The call began at 9 a.m. Wednesday. On one side, there was Rachel and me. On the other side, Denise, the general counsel, the chief financial officer, and Aaron. Aaron looked nervous. Denise looked composed. But I could see one thing had changed. Her folder was thicker. She had prepared for this meeting. The general counsel began. He said Arden Peak valued my contributions and wanted to ensure the separation process was handled fairly. I said, I appreciate that. He said the company believed the incentive plan gave it discretion. Rachel said, the company has discretion before performance is determined. Here, the performance period has ended, the client's success targets have been met, and the employee is being separated due to restructuring. The CFO asked whether I believed I was entitled to the full payout. I said, I believe the plan should be administered according to its written terms. Denise leaned forward. This is not about what Claire deserves. This is about maintaining a consistent framework. I looked at her. Then I agree, I said. The framework should be applied consistently. For the first time, Denise did not have an immediate answer. The general counsel asked if I had information suggesting inconsistent treatment. Rachel answered before I could. We are asking the company to confirm whether Section 7.4 has been applied to employees who were involuntarily separated after the performance period in prior years. The CFO looked at Denise. It was subtle, but I saw it. He was asking a question without saying it. Have we paid someone else? Denise said the company would review the matter. The call ended without a decision. But after that call, I knew the issue was no longer just my bonus. It had become an internal problem. Because if Martin had been paid under the same clause, then denying me was not a neutral policy decision. It was a choice. And choices create liability when you cannot explain them. 2 days later, I learned that the company had started reviewing prior separations. Not because anyone told me directly. Because Aaron called me. He said he was sorry. I asked what he was sorry for. He said he did not realize they were taking my bonus away. I asked, what did you think they were doing? He was silent. Then he said, Denise said the policy required it. I said, did you read the policy? Another silence. I assumed she had. That sentence told me everything I needed to know about how the company had gotten there. One person made a confident statement. Everyone else accepted it because she was HR. No one checked. No one asked why the timing had changed. No one questioned why my role had to be eliminated on December 1st instead of December 16th. They assumed that because it came from human resources, it had to be fair. But human resources is still made up of people. And people can make decisions for the wrong reasons. By the following Monday, my final 2 weeks had turned into a strange performance. The company needed me to transition 12 client accounts. The new customer operations group had no clear leader. Sales wanted control of renewal conversations. Support wanted fewer escalation calls. Finance wanted clean revenue forecasts. And no one wanted to be the person who told a client that the executive they trusted was gone. I did my work. I created transition files. I recorded account histories. I documented known risks. I scheduled internal walkthroughs. I answered reasonable questions. But I stopped fixing problems that belonged to people who had the authority to solve them. When a sales manager asked me to personally reassure a client about a renewal that would close after my end date, I said I could provide a written account summary. When Aaron asked me to attend a weekend planning session without additional terms, I said my transition obligations were already defined. When Denise asked me to train the new customer operations lead on my entire leadership process, I asked for the written scope and timeline. She did not like that. She had expected gratitude. She got professionalism. And professionalism is difficult to manipulate when it is documented. Then, on my second to last day, the company made its third and worst mistake. They announced my replacement. Her name was Kelsey. She was 29. She had worked in sales operations for 18 months. She was capable, eager, and completely unprepared for the job they had given her. I did not blame Kelsey. She had been handed a title, a larger salary, and a department that had taken me a decade to understand. The problem was not her. The problem was that Denise and Aaron announced her appointment to my team before she had even spoken to me. They said she would modernize the client success function. They said she would bring fresh operational discipline. And they said she would oversee all strategic accounts effective immediately after my departure. The next morning, 2 of my strongest account managers resigned. Not because I asked them to. I did not. They had already been interviewing elsewhere after the restructuring. But the announcement made their decision easier. They knew Kelsey had never handled a major client escalation. They knew she had never negotiated a renewal rescue plan. And they knew the company was treating experience like a problem to be solved instead of an asset to protect. One of them, a woman named Priya, came to my office before leaving. She closed the door and said, "They really think you are the problem." I said, "They do not think I am the problem. They think admitting the real problem would be too expensive." She asked what I meant. I told her, "I mean keep your records." That was all. By the end of the week, Arden Peak had lost me, 2 account managers, and the confidence of 3 clients who had asked why their entire leadership team was changing right before renewal season. The company had not paid a dime of my bonus yet. But suddenly, they needed the knowledge behind it. That was when the calls began. My last day was Friday, December 13th. The bonus payout date was Monday, December 15th. At 3:40 p.m., I finished my final transition meeting. At 3:52 p.m., I turned in my laptop. At 4:05 p.m., I walked out of Arden Peak with 1 tote bag, a framed photo from a client opening event, and a small plant I had somehow kept alive through 3 office renovations. Nobody escorted me out. Nobody made a speech. Denise sent a brief email thanking me for my service. It ended with the phrase, "We wish you the best in your future endeavors." I read it in the elevator. Then I deleted it. At 8:17 a.m. Monday, I checked my bank account. The severance payment had arrived. The bonus had not. I was not surprised. Rachel had already prepared for that possibility. At 8:43 a.m., she sent a notice to Ardent Peak's legal team. It said the company had failed to include the incentive payment required under Section 7.4 and requested confirmation of payment by the end of the day. At 10:12 a.m., the general counsel responded. He said the company was continuing to review the matter. At 11:26 a.m., Rachel replied that the company had been reviewing the matter for nearly 2 weeks and that the policy language was clear. At 1:05 p.m., Ardent Peak sent a revised separation agreement. The bonus amount was still 0. But there was a new paragraph. It offered an additional 4 weeks of severance if I agreed not to pursue any claim related to incentive compensation. That was when I knew we had them. Not because the offer was generous. It was not. It was because they were trying to buy certainty without admitting why they needed it. Rachel called me. She said, "They are worried about precedent." I said, they should be worried about what they did. By 3 p.m., more information had surfaced. The company's internal review had confirmed that Martin Shaw received his bonus after his role was eliminated the previous year. So had another employee, a senior product manager whose position had been cut in a reorganization after she completed her targets. Both had received payments under Section 7.4. Both had been actively off payroll on the payment date. Both had received the same benefit Denise told me was impossible. The only difference was that Martin was close friends with the chief revenue officer, and the product manager had negotiated directly with legal before signing her agreement. I had not known that when I walked into Denise's office, but I knew it now. At 4:18 p.m., the general counsel requested another call. This time, Denise was not on it. That was not an accident. The general counsel said the company had completed its review. He said it had identified ambiguity in the administration of the incentive plan. I almost smiled. Ambiguity. The company had written the policy. The policy was not ambiguous. Their choice had been. Rachel said, "Is the company prepared to correct the calculation?" He said yes. The full incentive award would be paid, not a prorated amount, not a settlement disguised as a bonus. The full amount. $184,000. But that was not all. Because once the company confirmed different treatment under the same plan, Rachel raised the second issue. My annual equity award. For 3 years, I had received restricted stock units tied to performance and tenure. The separation agreement treated unvested units as forfeited. That was standard. Except the equity plan had a change in role provision. If a participant was terminated without cause as part of a qualifying restructuring within 90 days of a corporate transaction, a portion of the unvested units accelerated. Ardent Peak had announced, internally, that it was in talks to sell a minority stake to a private equity firm. The transaction had not closed. But the board had approved the process. And the company had been cutting staff to improve its financial picture before the deal. Rachel asked whether the company had evaluated the equity provision. The general counsel went quiet. Not defensive. Not angry. Quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you someone just found a second document they should have read before making a decision. The next day, they confirmed the equity acceleration applied. My vested units were valued at approximately $102,000. They had not fired me over a performance problem. They had eliminated my role as part of the same restructuring that activated 2 protections they had ignored. By the end of the week, Ardent Peak paid everything. The $184,000 incentive award. The $102,000 equity value. The corrected vacation balance. And an additional payment to cover the benefit continuation period they had calculated incorrectly. The total came to just over $286,000. That was the number in the headline. But money was not the moment that stayed with me. The moment came 3 weeks later. Kelsey called me at 7:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. I almost did not answer. But I did. She sounded overwhelmed. One of our largest clients, North Star Home Goods, had discovered that a critical reporting integration would fail during their January inventory cycle. The client was threatening to delay renewal discussions. Sales was blaming support. Support was blaming implementation. Aaron was asking Kelsey for an answer she did not have. And Denise, apparently, was asking why the client success function had not anticipated the risk. Kelsey said, "I know you are not with the company anymore, but I do not know who else understands this account." I felt sorry for her. Not enough to solve the company's problem for free, but enough to be honest. I told her I could not advise her as an employee because I was not one. I said if Arden Peak wanted my help, their legal team could propose a consulting arrangement with a clear scope, payment terms, and authority. She said she understood. 20 minutes later, the general counsel emailed me. Not Denise. Not Aaron. Legal. They wanted a 30-day consulting agreement. They offered more than double my old daily rate. They agreed that I would report directly to the COO for the limited client transition work. And they agreed that any recommendations I made would be documented and client-facing decisions would require executive approval. I accepted. Not because I wanted to return. Because I had learned the difference between being needed and being valued. When I walked back into Arden Peak as a consultant, Denise was waiting near the lobby. She looked tired. Not defeated. Just smaller somehow. She said she was glad I could help. I said, "I'm glad the company found a business reason to respect my time." She nodded. Then she said, "I know you felt the process was unfair." I looked at her. "I did not feel it was unfair, Denise. I read the documents. It was unfair." She did not respond. What could she say? She had told me it was just business. So I made it my business to understand every part of the business they thought I would ignore. And that was the part they never saw coming. The lesson is not that every layoff is illegal. It is not. Businesses restructure. Roles get eliminated. Budgets change. And sometimes good people lose jobs for reasons that have nothing to do with their work. But it's just business does not mean you should stop asking business questions. Read your offer letter. Read your bonus plan. Read your equity documents. Read the separation agreement before you sign it. And keep copies of the policies that affect your pay. Do not assume HR has explained the whole rule. Do not assume a calm voice means a correct answer. And do not assume that because you are not an executive, the protections in a company policy do not apply to you. If your role is eliminated, ask clear questions. Is this termination for performance, cause, or restructuring? When did the performance period end? Has compensation already been calculated? How has the policy been applied in similar situations? What happens to bonuses, commissions, equity, vacation, and benefits? You do not need to be hostile. You do not need to make threats. You need to be precise. The strongest position is not yelling that you were treated badly. It is calmly showing the written policy, the dates, the facts, and the exact place where the company failed to follow its own rules. Being untouchable does not mean a company cannot eliminate your job. It means they cannot erase your value by hoping you are too intimidated, too tired, or too grateful to read the fine print. 3 weeks after I left, my replacement called me at 7:14 p.m. because the client crisis they said I would never be needed to solve had already reached the CEO. But that next story gets even better because the company did not just need my knowledge. They needed access to a system only I knew how to rebuild, and their first offer was so disrespectful I almost laughed. Subscribe, because when my replacement asks for help, I do not ask what went wrong. I ask one question: what is my consulting rate?